The engine noise echoed in her ears. Under a leaden sky, low clouds hung as if about to descend, heavy with the smell of gunpowder and sea spray. The young woman, barely 20, wearing a rumpled Japanese nurse's uniform, sat trembling on a hastily made wooden chair inside a makeshift medical tent. Her hem was torn to shreds, the left sleeve soaked with blood, dry red streaks clinging to the coarse fabric. The tent air was thick with the sharp sting of antiseptic, mixed with sweat, and the metallic, rusty smell of medical instruments scattered on the table. Training words rang in her head. Being captured is a disgrace. Better to die than live in the enemy's hands. A Japanese woman must never endure humiliation. If captured, choose to end your own life. She had sworn that oath at 17 during brutal training, sworn before the national flag, sworn before the emperor, that she would never allow herself to become a prisoner. And now that oath lay in pieces. Before her, a blond American in uniform bent over, his large hands careful and gentle as he wrapped gauze around the wound on her arm. She stared, so tense her whole body was rigid. Each time his finger brushed her skin, she flinched as if struck. Only one question spun in her mind. Is this when he will humiliate me? When he will mock me, or when he will plunge a knife in to finish me? But he did not. The American soldier said little, murmuring something in English she did not understand, in a steady, low voice that carried no hint of contempt or threat. When the clean, white bandage covered the wound, she realized she had not been hurt further. She even felt some relief. In that moment, every image of the enemy in her imagination, brutal, savage, delighting in torture, wavered. Around the tent, a few other women sat dazed. One held a steaming bowl of soup, eating with shaking hands. Another wore freshly issued clothes that still smelled of soap. An older woman bit into a piece of bread and then broke into sobs, tears mixing with her food. The scene felt like a strange dream. Only days before they had been starving, wandering in the forest, eating leaves and forcing down musty grains. Before capture, they had been prepared for death. In harsh training, Japanese officers had planted in their minds the belief that any who surrendered would be stripped naked, raped, tortured to death in shame. Those horrific images became an obsession. None of them had dared imagine living after falling into American hands. Yet here they were being fed, clothed, treated as if they still had some value. The young woman watched the bowl of soup set before her in silence. Steam rose, the smell of meat and vegetables spread, evoking distant memories of family meals before the war. Her stomach growled, but her hands hesitated. Her commander's warning sounded in her head. The food will be poisoned. Their smiles are traps. They wait only for your weakness to mock your shame. Still, when she glanced to the side, she saw other women devouring their food. No one was dying. Their tears fell from joy, not pain. She raised the spoon to her lips. One small sip, and a rich, savory flavor flooded her mouth. Nothing like the thin, mixed with bran rations she had endured for months. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. What had felt like betrayal tasted like salvation, and it triggered a new crisis. If the enemy feeds me, why did my commanders leave me to starve? If they bandage my wounds, why did my comrades abandon the wounded? On the first night in the camp, when she was led into a wooden barrack, she saw beds lined up neatly. Each bed had a blanket, no cold dirt floor, no lashes, no smell of death. She sat on a bed, placed her hand on the blanket, trembling as if touching something forbidden. In the Japanese army, comfort was synonymous with weakness. Here, even a single blanket felt like an admission that her life deserved warmth. Outside, a pale moon drifted between the clouds. The American camp was unusually quiet. Only the wind threaded through the barbed wire and the murmur of sentries. No shouting, no curses, no one forcing them to kneel or chant slogans. A strange sound drifted from somewhere, a harmonica, sprightly and soft. A sad but gentle melody passed through the air and slipped into the hearts of prisoners who had just lost all faith. She lay on the bed, eyes wide, staring at the wooden ceiling. Fear still lived inside her, but mingled with something more dangerous. Curiosity. If everything she had believed was wrong, what else had been a lie? If surrender was not the ultimate disgrace, where did true honor lie? She remembered training days. A comrade collapsed from exhaustion only to be slapped by an officer. Meager rations stretched so thin they had to mix in bark to fill their stomachs. She remembered the wounded left behind, no one to help. Compared with the present, hot soup, white bandages, warm blankets, gentle music, the gap cracked open her convictions. Before closing her eyes, she whispered to herself, "If this is a dream, don't let me wake. But if this is real, then everything I thought I knew about war and honor may have been a lie." On the first morning in the prison camp, sunlight streamed through the small windows, casting pale gold across the wooden floor. Somewhere outside, a metal bell clanged, steady, without the harsh urgency of assembly whistles in Japanese barracks. The young woman opened her eyes and realized she was still lying in bed, under a warm blanket. The strangeness of it made her heartbeat quicken. No one had torn the blanket away. No officer's shout split the air. No rifle butt struck her back. Instead, the faint aroma of freshly baked bread drifted in from the camp kitchen. She sat up and looked around. Other women were also waking. Fear still lingered on their faces, but in their eyes flickered a strange light, the light of survival. A woman beside her whispered, "Last night, I slept. For the first time in months, I didn't hear the sound of shelling in my dreams." Her voice trembled, as if afraid of betraying herself with such a confession. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, a wide room with long wooden tables and neatly arranged chairs. On the tray sat bread, butter, a few slices of fried egg, and a steaming cup of black coffee. To Americans, it was nothing more than a simple breakfast, but to the women, it was an unthinkable feast. The girl stared at the tray, torn between hunger and suspicion. She remembered gnawing on hard potatoes with her comrades, drinking rainwater to endure the days. Now the golden egg before her made her stomach twist painfully. One prisoner could not hold back and devoured her meal. Moments later, she broke down sobbing, her mouth still full of bread. The sound of her crying carried through the hall, and others' eyes filled with tears. The girl cautiously bit into her own food. The rich, buttery taste spread over her tongue, and tears welled up. In that instant, she realized she was still alive, and that her survival was not chained to shame, but to the mercy of those once called demons. The days that followed unfolded with a strange regularity, as if belonging to another world. Each morning, they lined up for roll call. American guards stood firmly but did not shout. They read names and nodded. Some women who knew a little English translated for the group, but gradually a few learned simple words themselves: name, number, good morning. At first awkward, the exchanges soon became routine, and to many it felt like stepping into a new life. In the afternoons, American medics came to check their health. They handed out medicine, dressed wounds, even gave them vitamins. The small, brightly colored pills puzzled the girl. In the Japanese army, medicine was scarce and usually reserved for officers. Ordinary soldiers and female aides like her were left to endure their suffering. Now, even the enemy pressed medicine into her hand. The thought stirred unease. What is honor if my commanders treated my life as worthless while the enemy seeks to protect it? The camp had a small yard where prisoners were allowed to walk. One day she heard music from a radio. The rhythm was lively, completely unlike the stern military songs she had been forced to sing. An American soldier smiled and whistled along. The girl stood by the fence, listening, torn between strangeness and fascination. The melody awakened memories of her youth when her father sang gentle Japanese folk songs at home. Her chest ached, for the music reminded her of a part of humanity buried under the war. At night, in the wooden barracks, women whispered to one another. They spoke of tomorrow, of their families, of fears if Japan were to lose the war. An older woman suddenly asked, "If we return, will anyone believe that here, the enemy let us live as human beings?" Silence fell. They all knew the truth would be branded as betrayal. In Japan, prisoners of war were considered shameful, no matter their suffering. The girl lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. The question cut into her heart like a blade. If I survive, I will be seen as a traitor. But if I die, who will know that here I was treated with humanity? Between those choices, she felt herself torn apart. One morning, paper and pens were distributed for letters home. With trembling hands, she wrote a few short lines. I am alive. I am well. So simple, yet her heart pounded wildly. She had once believed she would never again write words about her own survival. The American Guard collected the letters, promising they would be sent through the Red Cross. She did not know if hers would ever arrive, but just being allowed to write filled her eyes with tears. Weeks passed, and the prisoners' bodies recovered. Color returned to their thin cheeks. Some even laughed, something that once seemed impossible. Yet the more life returned, the more unsettled the girl became. For each passing day revealed the betrayal of her old beliefs. The officers had drilled into her mind, "The Americans will kill you, humiliate you." But those words had dissolved. In their place grew a new fear. If all of it had been lies, was anything left that was true? One night she overheard a young prisoner whisper, "Perhaps here, we live more as human beings than we ever did in our own army." The words cut deep into her thoughts. She did not reply, only closed her eyes, but inside her a storm raged. For she knew, no matter how much she resisted admitting it, the words were true. When spring came, small flowers bloomed by the barbed wire. The girl gazed at them, feeling warmth and sorrow at once. Amid fences, rifles, and guards, the flowers dared to bloom. And she suddenly understood. Even in war, even as a prisoner, a person might still find a fragment of paradise, not in some distant place, but in the unexpected humanity of those once called enemies. That summer, the sunlight poured down on the American prison camp like rivers of fire. But for the Japanese women prisoners, the harshness no longer came from the weather. It came from a quiet struggle in their minds. Day by day, the gap between what they saw and what they had been taught grew more obvious, like a widening crack in the mirror of their beliefs. One midday, while waiting in line for food, the young woman overheard some American soldiers talking and laughing. She did not understand everything, only caught a few words. POW, healthy, gaining weight. A guard pointed at the line of prisoners, shrugged, and laughed. His look carried no contempt. It was more like a casual observation. They were getting healthier, regaining weight. Her cheeks flushed. It turned out that while her countrymen back home were starving and dying under bombardment, here, in the enemy's camp, she and the other prisoners were being properly cared for. That evening, in the wooden barrack, the prisoners whispered the rumors they had eavesdropped on. Bombs had fallen on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. Thousands perished in the inferno. Houses turned to ash. One woman curled up and wept. "My family is there. If they are alive, they are probably starving." The room fell silent. Tears could not stop the bitter question. Why are we, those branded with shame for being captured, fed and warm, while our people die of hunger at home? That contradiction gradually became a haunting specter. By day they smiled over bowls of rice, slices of meat, cups of coffee. But at night, Under warm blankets, they tossed and turned with unanswered questions. The young woman woke many times with her heart racing, cold sweat on her brow. Have we betrayed our country? Are we living on the mercy of the enemy while our loved ones starve? One day, a Japanese-American prisoner, the camp interpreter, came into the room. He spoke fluent Japanese, and his Asian features made them both surprised and uneasy. He told them his parents had emigrated to America before the war and that he now served in the U.S. military. He looked at them calmly. Here, you will be cared for. It's policy. Americans do not want you to die. A middle-aged woman asked in a trembling voice. Why? We are the enemy. He paused, then replied slowly, because to us even the enemy is human. War may make us opponents, but it does not erase that. That answer struck like a hammer. The propaganda that Americans were inhuman devils suddenly seemed a cruel joke. The young woman bowed her head and wept into her shaking hands. For the first time, she felt she was not just a tool or a uniformed corpse. She was a human being acknowledged. In the following weeks, the camp allowed prisoners to do light duties: laundry, tending the vegetable garden, cooking. She was assigned to the cooking crew. As she sliced vegetables, the sharp smell of onions stung her nose, and she involuntarily remembered the small kitchen of her old suburban home outside Tokyo. Her mother used to cut onions the same way, tears streaming from the sting. Now she cried again, but not from the onion, from memories flooding back, memories of a peaceful life stolen by the Empire. On another day, news arrived that Allied prisoners had been liberated from Japanese camps in Southeast Asia. Stories of forced labor, starvation, beatings, a 1 in 3 death rate, all of it reached the ears of the Japanese women. They sat motionless, faces drained of color. Here they were being fed, treated, and shown humane care. Guilt pressed on them. Americans cause suffering to the Japanese, yet they save our lives. The Japanese brutalize Americans, but we are forgiven. Where is justice? Where is honor? At night, she turned her face to the wall and tried to stifle her sobs. In the darkness, questions burst forth. If so-called honor only leads people to die of hunger and cold, is it worth it? If the enemy shows mercy while our comrades abandon us, who is truly noble? Each question cut into the pride she had clung to. Occasionally, an American guard passed by and left them a cigarette or a scrap of chewing gum. Those small human gestures unsettled them further because they were so ordinary, so unlike the demons the Japanese propaganda had painted. One night, when given a little candy, the girl tasted the sweetness and tears spilled down. That sweetness comforted her, and at the same time accused the lies she had believed throughout her youth. On the day she was allowed to write a second letter home, her hand shook uncontrollably. She wanted to write that she was being treated kindly, to tell them the enemy were not monsters. But she stopped. If such a letter reached her family, it could mark them as kin of someone who had betrayed national honor. In the end, the paper held only a few dry words. I am well. Please don't worry. The American prison camp was, for her, both a refuge and a hell of unanswered questions. Every full meal, every warm sleep, every smile from a guard felt like a pinprick into her old convictions. She felt as if walking between two worlds. On one side, the past, with its harsh Bushido vows. On the other, the present, shockingly humane. Between them lay her soul, torn, bleeding, uncertain which was true and which was false. One moonlit night, when the barrack was asleep, she rose and pressed her face to the small bars of the window. Outside, moonlight fell on the grass and silvered the strands of barbed wire. In the distance, an American guard leaned against his post, playing a tune on a harmonica. The music floated softly, like the wind. She listened, and an unfamiliar feeling rose within her, a desire to live, to discover the truth beyond the wall of lies. In that moment, she whispered to herself, "If this kindness is real, then the whole world I believed in has collapsed. But perhaps from those ashes, I will find the real person I am." The day the war ended, the sky was filled with gray clouds, yet inside the prison camp, the heaviness in the air was of a different kind. The news of Japan's surrender spread like a storm, racing through every wooden barrack. The female prisoners sat close together, their faces pale. Some burst into tears, others sat in silence with hollow eyes. The young woman clutched her blanket tightly, feeling as though her entire world had just collapsed. She had once sworn to die for the emperor, once believed the Japanese army was invincible. Now all of it was nothing but ashes. They had surrendered, and she, a prisoner, had suddenly become living proof of that failure. What filled her heart was not only grief, but also an invisible shame, the kind that Japanese society itself would heap upon her when she returned. In the weeks that followed, the Americans prepared to repatriate the prisoners. They handed out fresh clothes, shoes, even thin blankets to take along. Some guards smiled and shook their hands in farewell, while others slipped them extra candy or cigarettes. These gestures choked them with emotion, for their enemies were not sending them away with whips, but with kindness. On the day of departure, the young woman stood on deck as the sea wind whipped through her hair. The ship cut across the waves, carrying them eastward. Ahead lay home, but not the home she once knew. When they docked, the sight froze them in place. The port lay in ruins, houses collapsed, black smoke rose from half-burned buildings. People were gaunt, their clothes in tatters, their eyes sunken from hunger. Children ran barefoot across piles of rubble, hands outstretched in begging. As she stepped ashore, her heart clenched. Compared to this, the months spent in the American camp now seemed like a tender dream. There, she had hot soup, warm blankets, music. But here, her homeland, once meant to be a safe haven, had turned into a hellscape. Yet the greater shock came from people themselves. When they returned, neighbors looked at them with cold eyes. Someone whispered, "Those are prisoners, captured alive, shameful." The murmurs spread like knives. No one wanted to hear about the enemy's kindness. No one wanted to believe that in American camps they had been treated like human beings. For to admit that would mean acknowledging that the creed of guilt, better to die with honor than live in shame, was nothing but a lie. Within her family, her parents embraced her and wept with relief. But then her father whispered in a trembling voice, "Do not tell anyone what you went through. Do not let them know the enemy cared for you." The words struck like a blade, confirming that her truth was forbidden to exist. At night, in the small house that had survived the bombings, she curled up on a tattered mat. Cold wind slipped through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the cries of hungry children echoed from the neighbors' homes. She remembered the thick blankets in the American camp, the steaming bowls of soup, the soft strains of a harmonica. Each memory was both a comfort and a burden. Comfort, because they proved humanity was not only cruelty. A burden, because no one believed her, and she was forced into silence. Once she tried telling an old friend that American soldiers had treated them kindly, that they had given medicine and food. But her friend's eyes widened in horror, whispering, "Don't say that. People will think you betrayed us. Do you want your family shamed?" From then on, she remained mute. Her words stuck in her throat, turning into a stone that weighed on her whenever she remembered the past. Years later, as Japan began to rise again from the ashes, she still kept silent. Yet sometimes in the glow of sunset, when she heard someone playing a harmonica on the street, tears would fall. For she remembered that night in the camp, when the enemy, an American soldier, sat alone under the moonlight and played a gentle tune. In that moment, she had realized that humanity could be cruel, but it could also be full of compassion. And that truth, though buried, still lived within her. For her, The war did not end only with Japan's defeat, but with the collapse of an entire world view. The so-called glory of the empire had proved to be nothing but a ghost, while the true value of human dignity was discovered in the hands of those once called the enemy. The American POW camp, once feared as a hell, had transformed into a strange kind of paradise in her memory. A paradise of humanity, where she was for the first time acknowledged as a person. And perhaps from that memory she held on to a fragile faith, that one day when people dared to face the truth, Japan would no longer feed on lies that drove its people to death. That compassion, even from an enemy, could be stronger than violence, stronger than propaganda, stronger even than death. As time passed, the years of war slowly faded into the distance. But for the girl, now a grown woman, and later an old lady with silver hair, the memories of the American prison camp never disappeared. It was not just a period of her life, but a deep engraving in her soul where truth and falsehood had collided, leaving behind a permanent scar. Japanese society had changed after the war. The defeated nation became a close ally of the United States, and those who were once enemies now worked together to rebuild the country. Yet the silence surrounding the female prisoners remained. They were rarely mentioned in history books as if their existence were a source of shame. No one wished to acknowledge that Japanese women had once been captured, had lived in the enemy's camps, and had been treated with kindness. At the rare class reunions, old friends spoke of the war with grief, mourning the dead. But whenever the subject of prisoners arose, faces grew solemn and eyes turned away. No one dared to speak further, for that truth was too complicated, too contrary to what society wished to remember. One night, she sat on the porch of her house, listening to the radio broadcast commemorating the end of the war. The announcer's voice was solemn, recounting noble sacrifices and the rebirth of the nation. But in her heart, a different sound echoed, the harmonica melody beneath the moonlight in the American camp. That tune was neither grand nor a call to sacrifice. It was simply a human sigh. And to her, it was more real than any speech. Her grandchildren grew up in a peaceful Japan, few of them ever asking about her past. But sometimes a curious child would find in an old drawer a neatly folded handkerchief, the very one an American soldier had given her the day she boarded the ship home. Its edges were frayed, its fabric discolored, yet she still kept it. The child would ask, "Grandma, whose is this?" She would smile, her eyes glistening. "It belonged to someone who was once an enemy, but treated me as a human being." She never told the full story. She didn't need to. Sometimes truth doesn't require long explanations. It only needs a fragment of memory to prove that compassion can cross borders, nations, and enmities. For her, the greatest meaning of that experience did not lie in who won or lost, but in this, that even amid the storm of war, there remained small islands of humanity preserved. Those islands, a bowl of hot rice, a blanket, a song in the night, could save a soul from despair. She knew that if she spoke out, many would dismiss or scorn her. But the truth did not vanish for that reason. It lived in her memory, and in the memories of those who had also survived the camp. Even if it was not written in textbooks nor carved into monuments, the truth endured, quiet but steadfast. War would eventually be closed off by history. Later generations might see only numbers, maps, and treaties. But to her, war was made of faces, hands, and eyes, those of friends and foes alike. And in her memories, Americans were not only invaders, but also human beings who extended a hand in the darkness. As old age settled over her, she would often sit by the window, listening to the night wind. Sometimes, closing her eyes, she thought she could still hear that old harmonica. Its sound carried a final reminder that honor does not always lie in death, that truth does not always belong to the victors, and that humanity, fragile though it may be, can still serve as a lantern in the longest, darkest night. Her legacy was not medals, nor military exploits. Her legacy was memory itself, kept like a small flame, passing on to her descendants the belief that even in war, people can still find each other, recognize each other, and feel compassion for one another. And in this way, her story, the story of the Japanese women who had once lived in American prison camps, was no longer just a personal memory, but a vital fragment of history. A fragment that reminds us that war is not only destruction but also the ultimate test of humanity. For sometimes, it is the enemy who teaches us what it means to be human.